the Inner Game podcast, brought to you by the Science of Excellence, presented by Rob Hume, the leading elite athlete mental performance coach. Unleash your power.
Okay.
To go, boom. So, welcome onto the podcast, Susan Greenfield. Coming onto the show today, somebody with an incredible wealth of knowledge and background in matters to do with the brain, neuroscience and neurology. And Susan is somebody who I saw probably, I don't know how many years ago, 6, 7, 8 years ago, giving a TED Talks. And that was the first time that I came across you, Susan, and you blew my mind back then with the things that you're talking about. So thank you very much for coming on and giving up your time today.
Oh, Rob, it's a pleasure to be here.
So if it's okay with you, what I'd like to start with is what's the difference between the brain and the mind?
That's a really, really interesting question. And often people muddle the two or think that one is the... Okay, so let's just think about how we use those words. You wouldn't say, I'm broadening my brain, would you? Or you say, I'm broadening my mind. At the same time, you wouldn't say, I've got a mind tumor. People talk about having brain tumors. So the brain is a physical entity, something that I like to talk about when I used to get under my fingernails if I was dissecting it. So it's a sludgy thing that's generic. I mean, if you took your brain out and I took my brain out, they would look pretty much the same physically. Yeah. And yet you and I obviously are very different people. And it's the difference that touches on what the mind is. So the mind, when we talk about the mind, is something to do with being an individual. Yeah. Every time we use the phrase with mind in it, like I'm in two minds, make up your mind, broad-minded, narrow-minded, opening up your mind, it's something to do with an individual. Okay, so how can we progress with that? What I'd like to suggest, unlike many philosophers who think the mind is some kind of airy-fairy sort of alternative to the squalor of the physical brain, and it's some free-floating special thing. I think it is related to the physical brain, but in a particular way. I think it is the personalization of your physical brain, okay, which makes you an individual. Let me explain that. What's brilliant about the human brain especially, animals to greater or lesser extents will all have an ability to learn or adapt. A goldfish, not very much. A chimpanzee a lot, but we do it superlatively. We occupy more ecological niches on the planet because of our brilliant ability to adapt to the environment. Yeah? And this is possible because of something called plasticity. It doesn't mean to say the brain is made of plastic. It comes from the Greek plastikos, to be molded. The human beings do this best of all. Goldfish, not at all well. And it varies as in the evolutionary reel of things, but we do it brilliantly. And what happens is even if you're a clone, that's the same identical twin with identical genes, you'd still say you had an individual mind. You'd still claim if you're an identical twin, you're an individual. And the reason for this is that independent of your genes, when you are born, your physical brain will literally be imprinted by the environment. So everything you do, everything you experience will literally leave its mark on your physical brain. And the way this is done is by changing the pattern of connections between brain cells and the efficiency and way in which they work. Okay, so this has been shown many times for mental activities and for physical activities. Perhaps the most famous one of all is London taxi drivers, whom you may know have a brilliant knowledge of all the street names of London. Without recourse to a manual, they can recite how to get from A to B. They've got a brilliant memory because of the training they've done. And it was found that an area in the brain that relates to memory, this is some 20 odd years ago, called the hippocampus, it's bigger in London taxi drivers than in other people. Can you believe that? Because there's more connections and it's rather like a muscle. We're talking here about athletes. So obviously everyone watching this, if they're athletes, will be familiar with the notion the more you exercise a muscle, the bigger it gets. The more you exercise bits of the brain, for example, if you're a taxi driver exercising memory, the bigger that gets. But it does so by enhancing the efficiency of the connections. So because of that is what makes you unique, so that no one has ever been like you. For 100,000 years, we've stalked the planet. And it's that uniqueness that we call the mind. So I would say the mind, long answer to a short question, the mind is the personalization of the brain. Yeah. So it's not something separate from the physical brain, but it's the aspect or the feature of the physical brain that is its plasticity, that it adapts, and that's what the mind is.
Fantastic. And you said so many different things there, which was linking into some of my questions that I've got, and one of them that you mentioned there was about how if we have two brains of identical twins, clones, essentially. And I remember earlier in my research, one of the things that I was wanting to decipher was that whole argument of nature versus nurture. And you'd often hear, people talk about an athlete, for example, it's natural talent, it's God-given talent, and you'd hear even ex-professionals say it, but that never rested that well. It didn't, that somebody could just come into this world and there you go. And one of the things so I had my opinion, but there's a difference between having an opinion and having some actual kind of knowledge to back it up. And the thing that really changed gave me kind of credence in what I was thinking was correct was when I read a guy's book called Tim Spector. His book was called Identically Different.
Oh, okay, very good.
He studied, he's one of the most renowned researchers in the world on studying twins. And within that, and from that book, I then started to look at epigenetics, how the gene is influenced by the environment. And I'm one of the things that I was coming across when I was, as I said, in the early days of my research, was that I would read lots and lots of autobiographies of the greatest athletes. And I was just trying to find out what is it that makes these people tick. And one of the things that did keep coming up was the age at which they started to play their sport. Sure. For example, Tiger Woods, his dad was a bit of a golf fanatic and put a club in his hand when he was 3 years of age. Yeah. And when I look at like talent, I see it very differently. How would you see one's ability to develop skills and techniques in sport, for example? How would that fit into this neuroplasticity and genetics?
Okay, well, no one can do anything perfectly without repetition or practice. And the whole point about practicing something, whether it's reciting, learning a poem, or practicing a sport, is by repeating something over and over again, you're strengthening the brain, the connections in the brain. Yeah. So if you don't do that, it will be very hard. But typically, people will do repetition and practice if they find it enjoyable and if they're motivated to do it. And that's the thing. So anyone who repeats it, I've got a little flabby muscle. I'm sure if you trained me, my muscles will get bigger if I truly did that, just because they're muscles. And during COVID, I went running, which I'd never normally done before. And gradually, to my absolute joy, but nothing to do with any skill on my part, my body just got better, just because that's what bodies do, as you'll know. Yeah. But so the reason is then the difference is how to put yourself in a situation where you allow the brain cell connections and the connections to be constantly repeated and repeated and repeated, right? Learning a poem or like learning lines or, learning your times table, and that is the crucial issue. And I think that's the really interesting. How do you motivate someone? And why is it that some people get pleasure from something that someone else wouldn't? For example, cooking, which I find as boring as hell, I couldn't bear to do it, or gardening. Other people do this for shit. They love it. So obviously we're all very different in the pleasure we derive from certain experiences. And I think that perhaps that is the thing to explore rather than some nebulous talent, because you don't have a gene for good running or anything like that, or a gene for playing golf. You get better at playing golf if you rehearse. So it doesn't relate to a gene, but it relates to your mindset, your state of mind. Yeah. And I think that's something that's really interesting to explore.
And you also mentioned about patterns and how the brain works on the mind is creating these neural patterns, isn't it? And with some of the work that I do with athletes is trying to help them when they get stuck into a pattern that they then can't get out of. And there's a woman who was really big in the kind of psychotherapy type world called Virginia Satir, who said what's someone asked her the question of, what's the mind or the brain's number one function, and she said, well, often people say it's to survive, but in her opinion, she said something different, which has always stood with me, which was that the mind will constantly look for the familiar. It will keep looking and keep trying to maintain the familiar, because the familiar helps ensure survival. If it knows the patterns, if it knows the routines, then it can predict what it's going to do. Is that something that you would apply in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of small children, how they love the same story over and over again, even though they know the answer, they know how it ends. They love doing the same thing or playing the same game. And I think there is something perhaps very basic to human beings like that they like reassurance and routine and order, because otherwise you don't know what's going to happen to you, So anything, and also if you think about it, music and sport, they all have a certain element of rhythm or repetition to them, which is reassuring. And for me, there's a thin line between being frightened and being very happy and excited. Just think of a funfair ride, for example, that thin line between fear and sheer pleasure. Yeah. And I think the answer is that with pleasurable things like sex or dancing or music, there's cycling, the sequences that repeat and repeat and repeat, and it's repetitious. Whereas things that are frightening is when there's an unknown element completely. You don't know what's going to happen next. Yeah.
When
that's very frightening. Yeah.
Going to come.
Yeah. Whereas sequences, things that are in sequence, are reassuring. And human beings like sequences. I say when you think of the things we do just on a small level, like all movements or playing the piano, or reading is a sequence, gardening, cooking. These are all things that have very clear narratives, very clear linear activities. And I think that we get reassurance from that.
And you mentioned as well about pleasure, how some people can become really fascinated through playing sport and that sort of thing. Some people love cooking, some people love music. I'd imagine that a lot of that is driven down to that neurochemical dopamine. That for whatever reason, when somebody whatever age starts to take part in a sport, I know what it was like for me when I first started to play football. It was the first time that I really started to feel that I was good at something and I derived pleasure from it. And that was, I was getting these constant
dopamine surges in anticipation of something. So, but you don't quite know if it's going to happen, and then it does. And so a classic example of that in modern life is text messaging or WhatsApp messaging, where you send something and you don't know if they're going to reply or not, and then they do. And if they did all the time, it wouldn't be pleasurable. Now let's think about football, because I have to fess up, Rob, I'm not a great football fan, but anyway, I was watching football. When I think it'll sound very bad, and it struck me that plays just to that thing, because A passes to B. Will they get on or not? No. Yes, they have. No, they haven't. And it almost corresponds to little peaks, epochs of dopamine surging in the brain. Every time player A has the ball and passes to B, but some rival Y comes in and tackles and takes it away. So they're very short little bursts, rather like a text message might be. And you don't quite know the outcome. You hope it's going to be A passes to C, passes to C, but if X comes along, passes to Y. So there's that element of uncertainty, but immediate resolution, for each epoch. So I just wonder whether that might be why football is so universally appealing to people, because of the timing of it, and it sets up a situation. Is it going to happen or not? Yes, it is. Yes, it can happen or not. Yeah. Whereas something like cricket, I don't think that's a bit slower. I think it's not quite the same sort of epochs of things.
That does make sense.
It's just a thought. Anyway, I have no proof of that. It's just a thought that I had.
That certainly makes sense to me. And I think one of the things you hear about athletes, professional athletes who either have retired or think about retiring, is often the subconscious mind gives away its clues as to what is actually going on. And they say, this sport, let's say football, for example, it's an addiction to me. And imagine... Well,
dopamine is addictive. And drugs of abuse will all have in common the release of dopamine in the brain. So irrespective of the initial targets they work on, what they have in common is they release dopamine.
Yeah.
All of them, yeah.
And so could it? Do you think that it could be, obviously, you take somebody like a goal scorer, every time a footballer who's renowned for scoring lots. Let's take somebody like Cristiano Ronaldo. He scores a lot of goals and has done throughout his entire career. That process of putting that ball in the back of the net will release a huge amount of dopamine, won't it? Which would become very addictive.
Oh, totally. You want that experience again, and you want it again, yeah. So you carry on doing it. So back to what we were originally saying, where how do you get someone to do something, frankly, that's boring, which is repetition? Yeah, repeating an exercise over and over again, reciting. It's not just physical things; it's also mental things. And if it can be that they're anticipating that surge of dopamine, that is what. For example, I have a friend who plays golf, and I asked him why, because again, it's not my bag. And he said, just once, just by a fluke, he did some brilliant hole-in-one or something. And he said, it's just he wants to recapture that moment.
Right.
And that's why he just carries on doing it, to try and once again have that. And you see, a gambler will do the same thing. They win, and they want the game to have that roulette with that winning flush. So you have one event that gives you such pleasure.
Yeah.
And you carry on doing it. Yeah.
It's certainly something that I really try to encourage and get across to the athletes who I work with, and even people who I don't work with, but who may interact with some of the things that I do, is that enjoyment is right up there. Whether it's the most important thing or not, I don't know, but I know it's right there at the top, because in order to get up and train for however many hours it takes, take a marathon runner who just can't get away from the fact that is just hours and hours and hours of relatively monotonous.
Yeah.
You have to take joy in that.
Well, yeah, another one is rowing. In where I live in Oxford, where they have obviously big on rowing, people I know, have to get up at 5 a.m. in the dark in the winter to go and train, and that's not a lot of fun.
Yeah. To the average Joe person, that would be pain, wouldn't it?
Of course. I think they're mad. Yeah.
They have found a way in their mind of almost tilting that seesaw, this rowing at 5 a.m. to 95% of people is pain, but to them, it must be more pleasurable, mustn't it?
Yeah. But I think also it's to try and recapture something. It's not just a sensation, but you can envisage, I know if I go running, I'll stay slim and toned, and my heart will benefit. And you just think of all those things. Yeah. And it makes you, I'll be this and I'll be that, just imagine if I'm there. And I think having some kind of goal, or vision to work towards, again, is very motivating.
Definitely. And I think one of the common mistakes that athletes get caught up into it is, again, another pattern, the pattern of thinking about what they don't want to happen instead of visualizing, instead of seeing what they want to happen.
Well, that's exactly, I don't know if you've heard of CPT, the therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. So for people who are very depressed, rather than take drugs, an alternative is a talking therapy, where what the person does is try to break them out of the mold of the persistent thinking of what they're doing. So say they've had some horrible thing, a bereavement, say, they don't say don't think about the person, or, it doesn't matter, but it's just to see it in a different way. Yeah. So that you can move on with your life, but still there. And so it's not just in physical things, it's in mental things as well, that it's important to break out of molds, almost literally.
From my experience, and with the work that I do when it's more hypnosis based, where often people can get kind of trapped in a memory from the past. So as soon as we're talking about sport, let's try and keep it in that kind of frame. Somebody could have had, let's say somebody misses a penalty, a big penalty, a penalty shootout, and that event happened 6 years ago. They then lose the game. They lose the competition. It's a World Cup final, for example. In that moment, there's very little pleasure being experienced. It's pain. But that memory of that event, the emotional energy, emotion that stays, and unless they can reframe.
You have to reframe it. You can't forget it or obliterate it. You certainly can't take drugs to wipe it out. That's very stupid. Yeah. So what you do You try and see it in a different way, sort of silver lining. The other thing that's important, as we were saying earlier, is home advantage in sport. I was very interested. It's a really well-known phenomenon, as I'm sure you know. If a team is playing in front of the home crowd, they play better.
Sure, their fans, they feel more love from their fans.
Exactly. And it strengthens the identity, it's reaffirming, and
And what about the prefrontal cortex then?
Yes.
I spend a lot of my techniques, my neuroscience techniques, are developed to help people get better control over what their visual sensory system is doing, what they're seeing inside their head, and how they are internalizing what they're seeing is massively affecting how they go out.
How they interpret. Yeah. Okay. So I think there's several things there. Which, first of all, which leads on from the mind, and we'll come to the prefrontal cortex in a moment. But when you're very small, you just have pure sensation. So, for example, an example I like to give for a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old, if you showed them a wedding ring, say a gold shiny, it wouldn't mean anything. Wouldn't mean anything. They might be attracted to it because it's gold and shiny. It's smooth. They might roll it. They might put it out, but it wouldn't mean anything. It'd be a gold shiny thing. Yeah. But gradually, what will happen, because they're humans, as they experience rings, and they'll learn that's what they're called, the connections in the brain will make those associations. So as the child grows, it will learn that if they see someone with one of these things on, it means something about them, and they'll learn what it means. Eventually, they might have one of their own. And that will have associations that are very special, that have nothing to do with the pure sensory properties. In monetary value, it's probably not expensive even, compared to some of the things there. But it will be very special to them because of the associations, So we start to personalize the world around us, and we go what scientists call from sensory to cognitive. So that's to say, instead of evaluating the world in sensory terms, how sweet, how fast, how cold, how gold, how shiny, it's what does it mean to you? So think of you're in a crowded room and your partner, you see him or her across a room, and you'll see them much easier than everyone else because they mean, because of the associations they trigger to you. So what you're doing there is personalizing objects and people according to your human mind. Now, the prefrontal cortex, which I don't know if people have heard much about it, but it's a very sophisticated part of the brain, and it's particularly big in humans. And what's really interesting is your individual development is reflected in evolution, in that small children, their prefrontal cortex doesn't work very well, and it's only fully mature in late teenage years, early 20s, which reflects in evolution the fact that it's a very sophisticated part, that humans have a very large prefrontal cortex, and cats even have a much smaller one. Now, what the prefrontal cortex does, I like to say it's very sophisticated part there. I like to say it gives you a past and a future, because when it's underdeveloped, like when you're a small child, or if you're an animal, you just live in the present. Just live in the present. You have inputs come in, you respond to them. They don't mean anything, but you'll just respond to things. But the more developed your prefrontal cortex, the more you can interpret the world in terms of what's happened already, you know what a ring is, and the more you can plan ahead. So if you have damaged the prefrontal cortex, then you become very reckless, you're heedless of consequences. And what's particularly interesting, fitting with that, is that people who are obese, people who have a high body mass index, they have an under-functioning prefrontal cortex, as Michelle. So, which shows that they're putting more premium on the taste of the food rather than thinking of the consequences. Gamblers also have an under-functioning prefrontal cortex. So it's really interesting. People who are addicted to gambling have an under-functioning prefrontal cortex, so, as do children, So it's as though, as you mature, your prefrontal cortex enables you to escape the press of the present. You can actually see things in terms of what's happened in the past, and you can anticipate for the future. Now, the big deal is, guess what? Dopamine inhibits it, right? So dopamine, actually puts you in the present, where you are aware of your experiences. And we say, don't we, we're having a sensational time. If I say, Rob, let's go out and have a cognitive time, I don't think you'd want to come. But we talk about having a sensational time. We talk about blowing our mind, losing our mind, being out of our mind. And all those phrases harken back to what I said the mind was earlier. It's the person, and you let yourself go, literally. And the very word ecstasy in Greek comes from standing outside of yourself, ecstasy.
Wow.
So, and if you think wine, women, and song, drugs and sex and rock and roll, modern equivalent, all of those involve giving up your sense of self for a while, you know? Yeah. So, I mean, if you are self-conscious, you're a rubbish dancer, you know? Yeah. You know, if you're self-conscious, yeah. And people talk about being abandoned. So I think what's really interesting in human beings is that we have these two modes. On the whole, we have the mind, thanks to the prefrontal cortex, where you are an individual, you have a past, a present, a future, you're linear. But just occasionally, and you let yourself go. You go back to being like a child again, you know, where the dopamine surges and you're just in the moment. Yeah.
That's fun. Again, so many things to unpack there, Susan. And that in many respects, then, you know, our prefrontal cortex can, as it's largely the thing which is elevated us beyond all these other species.
Oh, yeah.
It's also the thing which it can be a curse. You know, people who struggle with depression and anxiety.
Indeed.
That's because, you know, depression is often in my realm of work anyway, and research is often about the past. You know, holding on to the past. So the features of depression, actually quite interesting, is something called anhedonia, a lack of pleasure. So a depressed person won't take pleasure out of a bird singing or the sun on their face, the sensations that people, they also move less. Now we know if you move, you know, and you are aroused, that is the dopamine. But if you're moving less, and a depressed person will see the world in grey tones. If you look at someone, if you ask them to paint a picture, it'll be very grey, and it's the opposite of bright senses or sensational, very solid. So it's the opposite of that. And we know also that depressed people feel pain more, for example, because they're moving, whereas the opposite of that, schizophrenia, people feel pain less. It's quite interesting, where the dopamine is very high. So I think depression, it's where you have perhaps a prefrontal cortex that is overly active, so that you're not engaging with the past. You're not engaging with the immediate senses coming in. You are there with your past and your future, you know. And the future being very bleak, of course, you know, that you're going to die and terrible things and so on. Yeah. And I guess that also links into athletes. If you was to look at, let's take, for example, one of the best teams in the world right now in the country is Liverpool. You know, they're high in confidence, they're playing really well, they're winning lots of matches. And I'm not a Man United fan, but I went to watch them with a friend the other day. And then when you watch that team, what you observe from them physically, just through watching them move, it was bringing in some of those elements. Their movements are slower. They almost look like their body is heavier. They're not as free flowing, and it has to be because of whatever internal state that they're in. It's somehow making them feel obviously depressed, but saddened in some way, or insecure in some way, which means that they can't express themselves and express their ability to their truest form. And I think, you know, what you were saying there, for me, you know, links across with that. When an athlete feels happy, they're in a state. We're different.
Well, just generally, have you ever known someone really happy sitting stock still?
Yeah.
Ever? What do you do when you're really happy? Yeah, you jump around. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, always. And that's what children are always doing. Yeah, children, unless they are something wrong with them, you know, they are always on the move. Yeah. It's a natural thing when you're happy. Yeah.
Anyway. One of the other things that you mentioned there was about how, you know, depressed people often paint a different picture internally.
Right, yeah.
How they're internalizing and experiencing the world it's not as it is, it's how they're perceiving it.
Well, that's the same for us all.
Yeah.
I could be devil's advocate and say to you, Rob, so how is the world as it is? Do any of us know what the world is? I remember my mum saying once, 1,000 years ago, saying, what I see as red, I don't know what you see as red. You know, and if you think about it, what is that? What is external reality? All we ever know is what we're experiencing ourselves. Yeah. You might be in a dream. I might be a figment of your dream, for all you know. Yeah, so reality is a lot. I've tried dreaming I'm a millionaire and it hasn't worked, so I don't think that's that. But
So the reason why I brought that back up about the greatness and how somebody who isn't feeling so great, and whatever label we want to give it, that's one of the things that I work with athletes in trying to change. Because, for example, if I get an athlete to think about a performance that they labeled, as that was a poor performance, it was shocking, it was bad, it was this, it was that. I get them to explain to me how they're internalizing that. What does it look like? Yeah. And one of the things they do say, it will be duller, it will be grayer, it will be kind of focused, that image. But when I then get them to think about one of their best ever performances, then their memory of that event and their perception and memory of that event is very different. It's a lot bigger.
It just places it. Yeah.
It's more colourful. And that's one of the things that I try to do with athletes to break them out of a pattern when things have been going wrong. Often their perceptions of their performances in games are grey, they're small, they're unfocused. Whereas I'm then trying to flip that round and get them to start to internalize their performances as being brighter, more colourful. And by changing that sensory kind of modality, it enables them to start feeling more positive about themselves and what they've done.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how literally the mindset can make a difference to things. Yeah. What I also find interesting, since I've been doing my 5K runs in the morning, is it doesn't make problems go away, but when you come back, somehow you can cope with them. And you're on top of them and you're on it, Yeah. And I think if you have problems and worries, doing physical exercise, if only people who realize who don't do it, just what a difference it makes to how you cope with things, and how you deal with things. If you could put it in a bottle and sell it, they'd be amazed at how it made you feel,
Definitely.
So, but I'm sure everyone knows this who's listening. If they're all athletes, they know this.
Well, yes. There's a book written by a guy called Dr. John Ratty. It's called Spark, and he speaks in there of a psychiatrist, a doctor who, if I'm honest, what he was saying was that he came a bit kind of disillusioned with people coming in to see him, and then him just handing out a bunch of pills, and then them being back in a few months. And then with a prescription, and he wasn't seeing any progress with the people that he was working with. And long story short, he, instead of starting to prescribe people with antidepressants and those types of things, he started prescribing them with exercise, different exercise programs and protocols.
So much better.
And he saw such a shift in the progress that his
I mean, it's so obvious. So I don't choose the pun "no-brainer," but it isn't literally no-brainer.
Another thing I'd like to talk about is, which again, linking back to, I guess, the prefrontal cortex and visualization is there's been studies done when they've looked at, and I've read one where they've done it with a piano, playing the piano, lifting weights, shooting basketball hoops, and there's another one I can't remember, where they get these groups of people, and for a month they get split them in half. One group goes away and actually physically does the thing,
and the others visualize that they're doing it.
The piano, they're lifting the weights, they're shooting the baskets, and the other one does nothing physical but imagines doing it.
Indeed, and you have the same brain scan, and the brain scans look. So I think that's really fascinating. And it reminds me of a quote from the very man who developed the treatment for Parkinson's, which is the disorder of movement, as you know. And this is one. And he said this brilliant quote. He said, "Thinking is movement confined to the brain." Now, if you think about this, so let's unpack that. What's the difference between a thought and a feeling? Say, okay. Now, feeling, as we say, you're in the present. You scream, you cry, you yell. That's it. Job done. But a thought, any thought, whether it's a lie, a hope, a fantasy, a story, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A equals B, B equals C. So therefore, A must equal C. So every thought is different from a feeling because it has a sequence of steps. A equals B, B equals C. So, you start off and then you end up with a conclusion to your thought. And how did you get from A to B? By a sequence of steps. A movement confined to the brain. And what I found really interesting, as that's a definition of thought as opposed to feeling, is that's why people say going for a walk helps them think. So Nietzsche said this, Darwin said this, a lot of people, because in a way, what you're doing by physically putting one foot in front of the other, that's actually doing what the brain does anyway, as steps, A equals B. So it amplifies it. Yeah. And like the ancient Greeks would go walking backwards and forwards. Yeah. And similarly, when you want to think straight, I'll set it. Again, we like this linearity of A equals B, B equals C. Yeah. So I think that's quite telling, that experiment, because it shows you that as far as the brain concerned, the important thing is not the contraction of the muscle. It's the thought that has preceded it. It's the thought to move the muscle. So when you ask someone to envisage something, they've got the thought, but they're not putting it into action. Yeah. But it's the thought that counts. Yeah. The movement confined to the brain. I find that really.
What about that notion then? I hear in the sports world the term muscle memory, but I do see a bit different than that, because I think, in order for me to move my arm like this, fair enough, it's the bicep that provides that, the final movement, but all of this is starting in here first, isn't it? And so the reason why when that term gets used is when somebody perhaps hasn't played sport for a long period of time, and then they say, the muscle memory is still there. But I think, but anyway, I don't know what you think about it, that it's more neural memory, that the neural pattern is probably still there and stronger.
Sure. Well, put it this way, if you didn't have a brain, the arm wouldn't move in any. So if the brain was disconnected from the arm wouldn't be, there'd be nothing there. Yeah. Now, I think what they mean by that is more metaphor, meaning it's kind of automatic, that once you've learnt something a lot, I think they don't quite mean it's literally the memory and the muscle. I think it's more that it's so automatic that you're not having to think about it or plan it, So if you're driving, for example, not like brilliant driver, but if you do things without thinking about it, because that, I think that's what people mean more, I think. But it's a phrase I don't personally use, but I think that's what people mean. Yeah. I need to wind up quite soon, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So in terms of that, in terms of about movement, and the performance of skill and replication of skills and techniques, is it as simple that from what I have perceived about skills and movement, that is it largely the cerebellum that is control of that, or because also there's this, I think I've heard yourself and other people say that often it's not just as simple that one role is confined just to one part of the brain.
Exactly. Yeah. The brain isn't a series of mini brains, and even you'll have sometimes academic scientists saying, "Oh, what's the function of this area or that area?" And that always used to get me, because any one function can be like vision has about 30 different brain areas that it relates to, and similarly, something like memory is split, through many, many different types of memory in different areas. And any one brain area can participate, like the prefrontal cortex does, in many different activities. And so it's misleading. Now, the cerebellum, just for those again who are not neuroscientists, is the cauliflower structure on the back that is a very primitive part of the brain. It's been called, and I think with some accuracy, the autopilot of the brain. So what that's very good as is when you have an input coming in and you respond immediately to it, an input-output out. Whereas another part of the brain is related to voluntary movement, where you just sit there and you decide to stand up. But the cerebellum are movements that are triggered by sensory input coming in. Okay, now, why this is really interesting is in Parkinson's disease, where people can't stand up and just move, because the bit of their brain for voluntary movement, sadly, has deteriorated. If you put them in an environment where they have the sensory trigger from which they will then move, i.e. you're recruiting their cerebellum, which is not damaged, then you find they can move. So what they do is if you put, say, paper Mr. Men footprints on the floor, a Parkinson person suddenly can walk, whereas they couldn't walk without the visual clue. So the cerebellum is this autopilot that gives a response to an input, response to an input, response to an input, where you're not having to voluntarily decide to do it. It's triggered, by that. So I hope that makes sense. But that's the cerebellum. So it's a different type of movement compared to the other part of the brain where you just voluntarily stand up or want to do something. It's not triggered by anything coming in.
Yeah. My last question for you, Susan. So in terms of of the brain and obviously therefore the body, we can't separate the two, and I know often people do that.
Yeah.
The way that I look at it,
they're all interfaced.
It's all one.
Mm.
So, in terms of a human's ability, is it infinite, or if these neural connections can just keep growing and growing and growing and bringing more information together, that is, to my understanding, that is an infinite thing. So therefore, with that, so could therefore be abilities and potential.
Sure. It's not so much infinite in the sense, it reminds me of my students when I used to teach, and they had what I used to call the bucket model of the brain. They'd learned so much, their brains were full up and they couldn't learn anymore. That's a wrong. So it's not that, nor is it infinite. Yeah. But what it's like, I don't know if you remember the old-fashioned kaleidoscopes as a kid, where every time you rotate it, the pattern changes. And that's what the brain's like. It's not so much that it's filled up or that it's full, or it could be filled up forever. It's more that everything that happens will change how it is. So you're constantly evolving. So it's the same brain, but it's constantly changing and evolving and being different according to what's happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
So think of it like those old kaleidoscopes, and I think that's a rather nice image for it.
That's great. Well,
okay.
We'll wrap it up there, Susan. Thank you very much for coming onto the Inner Game podcast and sharing some wisdom, some knowledge about the brain. And I hope anybody who's watching this can take some small nuggets of understanding about how their mind, how their brain is influencing the body, and obviously vice versa. And I think when we all learn to understand how the brain and the mind works, we can have better bodies and we can have better lives as a result.
And that's a better mindset. I mean, most important, having a better body is not so much that you want to have six-pack and show off the six-pack. It's more that it helps you cope with things.
Yeah.
Yeah, you feel on top of things. Definitely. Yeah, so keep up the good work, Rob. Brilliant.
Definitely. Well,
again, all the best then. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.
The Inner Game Podcast. Brought to you by the Science of Excellence. Unleash your power. Book your free consultation now.